Hi guys, tonight we're stepping back to the banks of the Nile, where love wasn't a choice and marriage was a business transaction written in hieroglyphs. Drop your city and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe light a candle for that gentle glow, and let's walk together into the scorching sand dunes of ancient Egypt, where your wedding day might just be your funeral rehearsal. Picture this. You're 12 years old and you've just been told you're getting married next week. Not to someone you chose, not even to someone you've met. Your father has arranged your entire future over a cup of beer and a handful of grain. Welcome to ancient Egypt, where Cupid's arrows were replaced with legal contracts, and your heart had about as much say in the matter as a mummified cat. You wake up in your mud brick house along the Nile. The morning sun already feels like it's trying to cook you alive through the tiny window opening. Your sleeping mat, a woven reed affair that's about as comfortable as modern airport seating, has left geometric patterns pressed into your skin. The air smells like fish, incense, and the unmistakable aroma of thousands of people living too close together without proper plumbing. Your mother approaches with the kind of smile that usually precedes bad news. She's holding a piece of papyrus, and you can already tell from her expression that your childhood just got cancelled. The papyrus contains your marriage contract. Yes, they had those, and that they were more detailed than most modern prenups. Every goat, every piece of jewellery, every grain of wheat has been itemised like an ancient Amazon shopping list. The contract doesn't mention love. It doesn't ask it about your feelings. It reads more like a property transfer agreement, because that's essentially what it is. You're not gaining a husband, you're becoming inventoryable. The document specifies that you'll bring a dowry consisting of 2 silver rings, a wooden chest, 3 linen dresses, and a mirror made of polished bronze. Your future husband, meanwhile, is contributing a house, some farmland, and apparently the overwhelming privilege of his presence. But here's where it gets really charming. The contract also includes a section about divorce. That's right, these ancient Egyptians were so realistic about marriage that they planned for its failure before it even began. If your husband decides he's tired of you, he can simply declare the marriage over. You get back your dowry minus a penalty fee, because apparently heartbreak comes with a processing charge. The most brutal part? You don't get to read this contract. You're female, which in ancient Egypt means you're about as literate as a decorative vase. Your father and your future husband's father have hammered out these details like they're negotiating the price of livestock, which, let's be honest, isn't far from what's actually happening. Your wedding preparation begins immediately. First, you're taken to the local priest's wife, who examines you like a piece of meat at the market. She checks your teeth. Yes, your teeth, because healthy teeth indicate you'll live long enough to produce children. She inspects your hands for calluses, proving you can work. She even examines your hair for lice, because nobody wants to marry into a pest-infested family line. The beauty treatments start next, and they're about as pleasant as they sound. Your eyebrows get plucked with bronze tweezers that feel like tiny instruments of torture. Your skin gets scrubbed with sand and natron, the same stuff they use to preserve dead bodies. The irony isn't lost on you that you're being prepared for marriage using mortuary supplies. Your wedding dress isn't white. That tradition won't exist for another few thousand years. Instead, you get dressed in your finest linen, which is basically see-through fabric that shows everyone exactly what they're getting. Privacy in ancient Egypt is about as common as air conditioning. The ceremony itself takes place in your family's courtyard. There's no church, no elaborate altar, just a priest mumbling incantations while your relatives drink beer and pretend this is a celebration rather than a business merger. The priest binds your hands together with a linen cord, the origin of tying the knot, while reciting spells designed to ensure fertility. Because in ancient Egypt, your primary job description is baby factory with housekeeping skills. Your new husband, who you're meeting for essentially the first time today, looks about as thrilled as you feel. He's probably 15, barely old enough to grow facial hair, but he's now responsible for managing a household and a wife he didn't choose. This is essentially ancient Egypt's version of an arranged blind date, except it's permanent and comes with legal documentation. The wedding feast features bread, beer, onions and fish. Lots of fish. The Nile provides protein, but it also provides a smell that permeates everything. You're expected to smile and look grateful while eating food that tastes like the river smells. The wedding night arrives with all the romance of a tax audit. Your new husband leads you to what will now be your shared quarters, a small room barely larger than a modern walk-in closet. The walls are mud brick, the floor is packed earth, and the only light comes from an oil lamp that flickers like it's having second thoughts about this whole arrangement. You're both terrified. He's never been alone with a woman who isn't his mother or sister. You've never been alone with a man who isn't your father or brother. The concept of marital intimacy wasn't exactly covered in ancient Egyptian sex education classes, mainly because those didn't exist. Everything you know about what happens between married couples comes from whispered conversations and the occasional glimpse of temple wall carvings that would make a modern person blush. Your husband approaches this situation with the confidence of someone who's learned everything about romance from hieroglyphic instruction manuals, which is to say, not much confidence at all. The ancient Egyptians had fertility spells, love potions, and enough aphrodisiac recipes to stock a modern adult store, but somehow forgot to include actual relationship advice. The consummation of your marriage isn't just personal, it's practically a community event. Your new family will be listening through the thin walls for evidence that the deed has been accomplished. No pressure or anything, but your entire future social status depends on proof that you've successfully transitioned from daughter to wife. In the morning, the blood-stained sheet will be inspected like evidence at a crime scene. But let's say you survive the wedding night with your dignity relatively intact. Congratulations, you're now a married woman in ancient Egypt. This means your daily routine has just transformed from relatively unpleasant to systematically brutal. You wake up before dawn, not because you want to catch the sunrise, but because there's an endless list of chores that need completing before the heat becomes unbearable. Your first task is grinding grain into flour using a stone quern that weighs more than you do. This isn't like using a modern food processor. This is back-breaking manual labour that takes hours and leaves your arms feeling like you've been wrestling crocodiles. The grain is often contaminated with sand and grit, which means your family's bread always has that distinctive crunch of potential dental damage. Water collection comes next. You grab your ceramic jars and walk to the nearest well or irrigation canal, hoping the water isn't too contaminated with whatever the neighbours have been dumping upstream. Clean water in ancient Egypt is about as reliable as weather forecasting, which is to say it's mostly guesswork and hoping for the best. Cooking happens over an open fire that fills your small house with smoke. There's no chimney, no ventilation system, just you trying to prepare meals while slowly suffocating. The menu is depressingly consistent. Bread, beer, onions, and whatever protein you can afford. If you're lucky, that means fish or duck. If you're unlucky, it means insects or nothing at all. Your husband, meanwhile, spends his days working in the fields, or at whatever trade his father has arranged for him. He returns home exhausted, hungry, and expecting dinner to be ready. Ancient Egyptian men didn't participate in household chores. That was considered women's work, along with childcare, textile production, and basically everything else that kept the household functioning. Evening brings its own challenges. There's no electric lighting, no entertainment system, no way to relax and unwind after a brutal day. You sit by oil lamplight, mending clothes or preparing food for tomorrow while your husband discusses business with neighbours or simply falls asleep from exhaustion. Privacy doesn't exist. Your house is 1 or 2 rooms shared with your husband and soon enough whatever children arrive. Personal space is a luxury ancient Egypt hasn't invented yet. Every conversation, every argument, every intimate moment happens within earshot of family members. It's like living in a reality TV show except without cameras and with significantly worse food. The pressure to produce children begins immediately. Your worth as a wife is measured primarily by your fertility. If you don't become pregnant within the first year, people start whispering about curses, divine displeasure, or your husband's potency. Ancient Egypt had fertility treatments, but they involved things like crocodile dung suppositories and prayers to gods who may or may not have been listening. Pregnancy in ancient Egypt is essentially a 9-month death lottery. There's no prenatal care, no understanding of nutrition during pregnancy, no pain management during childbirth. Women frequently die in labour, leaving behind husbands who immediately start looking for replacement wives. Your life expectancy as a married woman has just dropped significantly, and that's assuming you survive the wedding night. Let's talk about what happens when your ancient Egyptian marriage hits its first major crisis. Spoiler alert, there are no marriage counsellors, no self-help books or books, and definitely no couples therapy retreats. When problems arise, and they will, you're essentially navigating relationship drama with all the emotional intelligence of a sun-baked brick. Your husband comes home one evening and announces he's taking a second wife. Not because he's unhappy with you, necessarily, but because his first wife, that's you, hasn't produced a male heir yet. In ancient Egypt, polygamy wasn't just legal, it was practically a business strategy. More wives meant more potential children, which meant more workers for the family enterprise and more security in old age. You don't get a vote in this decision. Your opinion carries about as much weight as morning mist on the Nile. The new wife moves into your already cramped living space, and suddenly you're sharing not just your husband, but your cooking fire, your water jars, and your rapidly diminishing sanity. It's like having a roommate you never wanted who's also sleeping with your husband. The household hierarchy gets established quickly. The first wife, you technically outrank the newcomer, but that advantage lasts about as long as it takes her to get pregnant. If she produces a son before you do, congratulations, you've just been demoted in your own home. Ancient Egypt operates on a strict meritocracy when it comes to reproduction, and your value fluctuates based on your latest quarterly fertility report. Daily life becomes a delicate dance of territorial disputes. Who gets to use the good cooking pot? Who sleeps closer to the warmth of the fire? Who gets the fresher water from the well? These aren't trivial concerns when you're living in 2 rooms with multiple adults and whatever children have arrived. Personal possessions become battle lines, and sharing resources requires diplomatic skills that would impress modern United Nations negotiators. Your husband, meanwhile, tries to manage this domestic situation with all the emotional intelligence of a wooden statue. Ancient Egyptian men weren't trained in conflict resolution or household management. Their approach to marital problems usually involves working longer hours and hoping the women figure it out among themselves. When that inevitably fails, he resorts to making declarations and expecting immediate compliance. But here's where ancient Egyptian marriage gets really twisted. Divorce is actually easier than staying married. If your husband decides he's done with you, he can simply declare the marriage over and send you packing. You get your dowry back, minus whatever penalties are specified in your marriage contract, and you're free to return to your father's house in shame. The grounds for divorce are fascinatingly arbitrary. Your husband can divorce you for being barren, for being disobedient, for being too expensive to maintain, or simply for annoying him. Ancient Egyptian law doesn't require proof of wrongdoing, just a declaration that the marriage has failed. It's like modern no-fault divorce, except with significantly fewer legal protections for the wife. Women can also initiate divorce, but the process is considerably more complicated. You need to prove misconduct, adultery, abandonment, or extreme cruelty. The burden of proof is entirely on you, and witnesses are required. Given that most domestic disputes happen in private, gathering evidence becomes nearly impossible. You're essentially trapped unless your husband is spectacularly awful in public. If you do manage to secure a divorce, your options are limited. Returning to your father's house means admitting failure and burdening your family with an additional mouth to feed. Remarriage is possible but challenging. Divorced women are considered damaged goods, regardless of the circumstances that ended their first marriage. Your dowry has probably been diminished by penalties and legal fees, making you a less attractive prospect for future suitors. Some women choose a different path entirely. They simply disappear. Ancient Egypt is vast, the population is mobile, and record-keeping is inconsistent. A determined woman can walk away from her marriage and start over in a different village where no one knows her history. It's risky, travelling alone is dangerous, and single women face constant threats. But for some, it's preferable to staying trapped in an unbearable marriage. The children complicate everything. In ancient Egypt, children belong to their father's family line. If you divorce or abandon your marriage, you leave your children behind. Maternal rights don't exist in any meaningful way. Your sons will be raised to view you as the woman who abandoned them. Your daughters will learn that marriage is a trap they should expect to endure rather than escape. Religion offers little comfort. The ancient Egyptian gods are primarily concerned with cosmic order and agricultural cycles, not individual happiness or marital satisfaction. Prayers for relief from domestic problems are about as effective as shouting into the desert wind. The priests will happily accept offerings and perform rituals, but they can't actually solve your fundamental problem. You're trapped in a legal and social system designed to prioritize male authority and female compliance. As night falls over your complicated household, you lie on your sleeping mat listening to your husband snore while his second wife shifts restlessly nearby. Tomorrow will bring another day of navigating domestic politics, managing scarce resources, and maintaining the facade that this arrangement is working. The stars overhead offer no guidance, just distant light that illuminates how small and powerless you feel in the vast machinery of ancient Egyptian society. You thought the wedding was brutal. Wait until you discover what ancient Egyptian society actually expects from your marriage. Your union isn't a romantic partnership. It's a carefully orchestrated business venture designed to produce specific outcomes, and you're both the primary investor and the main product being manufactured. Your value as a wife gets calculated like livestock at market. Can you bear children? How many? What's the ratio of sons to daughters? Are they healthy enough to work? Do they survive past childhood? These aren't casual family planning conversations. They're quarterly performance reviews that determine your standing in the household hierarchy and your husband's reputation in the community. The pressure to produce a male heir becomes your full-time job. Ancient Egyptian inheritance laws favour sons almost exclusively. Daughters can inherit property, but only in the absence of male heirs, and even then, their inheritance transfers to their husbands upon marriage. Your womb becomes a production facility with one primary objective: manufacturing a boy who can carry on the family line and manage the family property. Every month that passes without pregnancy is a month of failure. Your mother-in-law starts making pointed comments about your fertility. Your husband begins looking at other women with calculating eyes. The neighbourhood gossips begin speculating about curses, divine displeasure, or your secret consumption of contraceptive herbs. The weight of expectation settles on your shoulders like a granite sarcophagus. Ancient Egyptian medicine offers fertility treatments that would horrify modern patients. Crocodile dung mixed with honey gets inserted as a suppository. Yes, you read that correctly. Ground-up hippopotamus teeth mixed with dates and beer becomes a fertility smoothie. These treatments are based on sympathetic magic rather than medical science. Crocodiles lay many eggs, so surely their waste products will inspire similar productivity in human females. The diagnostic methods are equally charming. Ancient Egyptian doctors determine pregnancy by having you urinate on barley and wheat seeds. If the barley grows, you're carrying a boy. If the wheat grows, it's a girl. If nothing grows, you're not pregnant, and everyone starts discussing your obvious reproductive deficiencies. This test actually works for detecting pregnancy. The hormones in pregnant women's urine do encourage seed germination, but the gender prediction is about as accurate as reading tea leaves. Once pregnancy is confirmed, the real terror begins. Ancient Egyptian childbirth happens without pain relief, surgical intervention, or any understanding of sterile procedures. You give birth squatting on a birthing stool while female relatives hold your arms and chant prayers to Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth. The irony of praying to a hippo, one of the Nile's most dangerous animals, for safe delivery is apparently lost on everyone involved. Complications during childbirth are handled with spells and amulets rather than medical intervention. Breech births, prolonged labour, and hemorrhaging are treated as spiritual problems requiring magical solutions. The mortality rate for both mothers and infants is staggering. Your chances of surviving multiple pregnancies are roughly equivalent to your chances of winning a modern lottery. Possible, but not something you'd bet your life on. If you do survive childbirth and produce a healthy child, congratulations. You've completed one unit of your reproductive quota. Now you get to do it again. And again and again. Ancient Egyptian families are large by necessity. High infant mortality rates mean you need to produce multiple children to ensure some survive to adulthood. Your reproductive years stretch from your early teens until your body finally gives out from exhaustion. Between pregnancies, you're expected to maintain the household, manage domestic production, and support your husband's career. There's no maternity leave, no recovery time, no acknowledgement that growing and birthing humans takes a physical toll. You're back to grinding grain and hauling water within days of giving birth, often while nursing an infant and managing other small children. The children you produce don't belong to you in any meaningful legal sense. They're assets of your husband's family line. Your sons will eventually inherit property and carry on the family name. Your daughters will be married off to create alliances with other families. You're essentially a subcontractor in a larger family enterprise, responsible for production but not ownership. Child rearing in ancient Egypt involves more survival than nurturing. Infant mortality is so high that parents often don't name children until they've survived their first year. Emotional attachment is a luxury families can't afford when death lurks around every corner. You learn to love your children fiercely while simultaneously preparing for the possibility that they won't survive to adulthood. Your relationship with your children is complicated by the power dynamics within the household. Your sons will eventually outrank you in the family hierarchy. Your daughters will leave to become reproductive assets in other families. The children you sacrifice your body to produce will ultimately serve interests that don't include your own welfare or happiness. As you watch your latest pregnancy progress, feeling the child move within your belly, while your back aches from hauling water, you realize the profound truth about ancient Egyptian marriage. You're not a wife so much as a biological manufacturing facility with emotions. Your success is measured in offspring produced, your value calculated in male heirs delivered, and your future determined by your capacity to survive repeated cycles of pregnancy and childbirth in a world that views your death as an acceptable cost of doing business. The economics of your ancient Egyptian marriage operate like a business partnership where one partner, that would be you, has no voting rights, limited profit sharing, and maximum liability exposure. Your husband's family invested in you like purchasing agricultural equipment. They expect consistent output, minimal maintenance costs, and complete operational reliability until you break down entirely. Your dowry represents the initial capital investment in this venture. Those silver rings, linen dresses, and bronze mirror your father provided aren't wedding gifts. They're your contribution to the family's operating capital. Your husband's family will use these resources to establish the household, and you'll never see them again unless the marriage dissolves. It's like contributing to a retirement fund that only pays out if you get fired. The family's economic strategy revolves around maximizing productive output while minimizing resource consumption. You're expected to generate value through textile production, food processing, household management, and child rearing while consuming as little as possible in terms of food, clothing, and personal necessities. Your diet consists primarily of bread, beer, and whatever vegetables can be grown cheaply. Meat is reserved for special occasions or when your husband needs to impress business associates. Textile production becomes your second full-time job. You spend hours each day spinning flax into linen thread, weaving cloth on a horizontal loom, and producing the clothing that keeps your family dressed and generates surplus for trade. Your fingers develop permanent calluses from working with rough fibres. Your back aches from hunching over the loom for hours at a time. The repetitive motion causes joint problems that will plague you for the rest of your life. The quality of textiles you produce directly impacts your family's social status and economic prospects. Fine linen indicates prosperity and skill. Coarse, uneven cloth suggests poverty or incompetence. Your reputation as a wife depends partly on your ability to create beautiful, durable fabrics that showcase your family's wealth and your personal capabilities. Food production and preservation consume most of your remaining time. You're responsible for processing grain into flour, baking bread in outdoor ovens that turn your workplace into a furnace, brewing beer that won't kill the family with contamination, and preserving meat and vegetables for consumption during flood season when fresh food becomes scarce. The brewing process alone requires expertise that takes years to develop. You must balance grain ratios, monitor fermentation timing, and maintain cleanliness standards that prevent deadly bacterial contamination. Ancient Egyptian beer isn't recreational, it's a dietary staple safer than water and essential for survival. Your family's health depends on your brewing skills, and mistakes can literally prove fatal. Your economic value extends beyond domestic production to include business networking and family diplomacy. Marriages create alliances between families, opening trade opportunities and providing mutual support during economic difficulties. Your behavior reflects on your husband's family reputation, affecting their ability to negotiate favorable business deals and arrange advantageous marriages for their children. Social events become business meetings where you're expected to perform perfectly. Your appearance, conversation skills, and domestic accomplishments are constantly evaluated by other wives who report back to their families about your suitability as an alliance partner. A poorly prepared meal or inappropriate comment can damage business relationships that took years to develop. The pressure to maintain appearances extends to your children's behavior and achievements. Your son's intelligence and physical development reflect your genetic contribution to the family line. Your daughter's beauty and domestic skills affect their marriageability and the size of dowries your family can command. Poor child-rearing results suggest incompetence that undermines your husband's judgment in selecting you as a wife. Property ownership represents another layer of economic complexity. Legally, you can own property in ancient Egypt, a progressive concept for the ancient world. However, practically, your property becomes integrated into household assets managed by your husband. You might technically own a plot of land or a collection of jewellery, but you can't access or dispose of these assets without your husband's cooperation. Business transactions involving your property require your husband's approval and often his direct participation. Banks and trading partners prefer dealing with men, viewing women as unreliable business partners prone to emotional decision-making. Your legal rights exist on papyrus but dissolve in practice when economic interests are at stake. The family's long-term financial planning revolves around your reproductive success and survival. Each child represents potential labour, future income, and security for elderly family members. Your death during childbirth doesn't just represent personal tragedy. It's an economic disaster that requires immediate replacement to maintain household productivity and child-rearing capacity. Insurance against this risk involves maintaining relationships with potential second wives, often your younger sisters or cousins who can step into your role with minimal disruption to household operations. Your husband's family evaluates these candidates during your lifetime, comparing their domestic skills, fertility prospects, and economic contributions to your performance. As you calculate the cost of your existence against the value you produce, the mathematics of ancient Egyptian marriage become brutally clear. You're profitable if you survive long enough to raise multiple children to adulthood while maintaining high productivity in domestic manufacturing. If you die young, become infertile, or fail to produce male heirs, your marriage represents a net loss that must be written off and replaced as quickly as possible. Now let's examine what happens when the economics of your ancient Egyptian marriage begin to unravel. Because, spoiler alert, they almost always do. The business model of treating wives as reproductive assets and domestic manufacturing units has some serious design flaws that become apparent once you're locked into the system with no escape route. Your first major economic crisis arrives when you fail to produce a male heir within the first few years of marriage. Your husband's family has invested significant resources in your dowry, wedding expenses, and ongoing maintenance costs, but you're not delivering the primary product they purchased. The whispered conversations behind mud brick walls grow louder. Your mother-in-law begins suggesting alternative solutions to the fertility problem. The proposed remedy involves bringing a secondary wife into the household, essentially hiring a subcontractor to fulfill the portions of your job you've failed to complete. Your husband's family frames this as a practical business decision rather than a personal rejection. But the impact on your economic position is devastating. Suddenly you're sharing resources with a competitor who might outperform you in the one area where your value is measured. Your household budget gets stretched thinner to accommodate an additional adult. Food rations decrease. Living space becomes more cramped. Personal possessions get redistributed based on productivity metrics rather than seniority. If the new wife produces a son before you do, your economic status within the family hierarchy plummets faster. The rest of your life. The quality of textiles you produce directly impacts your family's social status and economic prospects. Fine linen indicates prosperity and skill. Coarse, uneven cloth suggests poverty or incompetence. Your reputation as a wife depends partly on your ability to create beautiful, durable fabrics that showcase your family's wealth and your personal capabilities. Food production and preservation consume most of your remaining time. You're responsible for processing grain into flour, baking bread in outdoor ovens that turn your workplace into a furnace, brewing beer that won't kill the family with contamination, and preserving meat and vegetables for consumption during flood season when fresh food becomes scarce. The brewing process alone requires expertise that takes years to develop. You must balance grain ratios, monitor fermentation timing, and maintain cleanliness standards that prevent deadly bacterial contamination. Ancient Egyptian beer isn't recreational, it's a dietary staple safer than water and essential for survival. Your family's health depends on your brewing skills, and mistakes can literally prove fatal. Your economic value extends beyond domestic production to include business networking and family diplomacy. Marriages create alliances between families, opening trade opportunities and providing mutual support during economic difficulties. Your behaviour reflects on your husband's family reputation, affecting their ability to negotiate favourable business deals and arrange advantageous marriages for their children. Social events become business meetings where you're expected to perform perfectly. Your appearance, conversation skills, and domestic accomplishments are constantly evaluated by other wives who report back to their families about your suitability as an alliance partner. A poorly prepared meal or inappropriate comment can damage business relationships that took years to develop. The pressure to maintain appearances extends to your children's behaviour and achievements. Your son's intelligence and physical development reflect your genetic contribution to the family line. Your daughter's beauty and domestic skills affect their marriageability and the size of dowries your family can command. Poor child-rearing results suggest incompetence that undermines your husband's judgment in selecting you as a wife. Property ownership represents another layer of economic complexity. Legally, you can own property in ancient Egypt, a progressive concept for the ancient world. However, practically, your property becomes integrated into household assets managed by your husband. You might technically own a plot of land or a collection of jewellery, but you can't access or dispose of these assets without your husband's cooperation. Business transactions involving your property require your husband's approval and often his direct participation. Banks and trading partners prefer dealing with men, viewing women as... Desperation drives some wives to desperate measures. Black market contraceptives allow them to prevent pregnancies that might kill them, even though getting caught using birth control could result in divorce or worse. Others attempt to poison rival wives, sabotage their pregnancies, or spread rumours that damage their reputations. The household becomes a battlefield, where women deploy economic warfare tactics against each other. Some wives develop alternative income streams that provide limited financial independence. Skilled brewers, bakers, or textile workers can sometimes sell their products in local markets, accumulating small amounts of personal wealth that isn't controlled by their husbands. However, these activities must be conducted secretly since economic independence threatens the fundamental power dynamics of marriage. The most successful wives learn to manipulate the system by becoming indispensable through strategic relationship management. They cultivate alliances with their husband's business partners, maintain connections with their birth families, and develop specialized skills that can't be easily replaced. They position themselves as valuable assets rather than replaceable commodities. Yet even the most strategic wives face the ultimate economic reality of ancient Egyptian marriage. The system is designed to extract maximum value from their reproductive and productive capacity, while providing minimal security or compensation. Your marriage contract might guarantee a return of your dowry upon divorce, but it can't guarantee you'll survive long enough to collect it. You're operating in an economy where your primary asset, your own body, depreciates rapidly and can't be insured against loss. As you lie awake at night listening to your husband discuss household finances with his brother, calculating income against expenses while your latest pregnancy makes sleep uncomfortable, you understand the true brutality of ancient Egyptian marriage. It's an economic system that consumes women's lives to generate wealth and security for everyone except the women themselves. Your ancient Egyptian marriage isn't just governed by economic contracts and social expectations. It's also supervised by an extensive pantheon of gods who have very specific opinions about your reproductive performance, domestic conduct, and spiritual obligations. Unfortunately for you, these divine supervisors are about as reliable as weather forecasting and considerably more demanding than your mother-in-law. The religious requirements of marriage begin before your wedding ceremony and continue until death, assuming you survive long enough to die of natural causes rather than childbirth complications. Your spiritual duties include daily offerings to household gods, participation in religious festivals, and constant attention to ritual purity requirements that make modern obsessive-compulsive disorder look casual by comparison. Bes, the dwarf god of household mirrors, protection becomes your primary supernatural supervisor. His grotesque appearance, imagine a lion-faced, bow-legged dwarf with a feathered headdress, is supposed to frighten away evil spirits that might harm your family. You're expected to maintain a shrine to Bes in your home, complete with daily offerings of food, beer and incense that your family can barely afford. Missing these offerings might result in supernatural retaliation that could include anything from crop failure to infant death. Taure, the pregnant hippopotamus goddess, oversees your reproductive functions with the subtlety of her animal namesake. This massive, intimidating deity demands offerings during each pregnancy, promises of future devotion in exchange for safe delivery, and elaborate Thanksgiving ceremonies if you survive childbirth. Given that hippopotamuses are among the most dangerous animals in ancient Egypt, praying to a hippo goddess for safety contains a level of irony that ancient Egyptians apparently didn't appreciate. Your spiritual obligations extend beyond household deities to include participation in community religious festivals. These events aren't optional social gatherings. They are mandatory demonstrations of family piety that affect your husband's business relationships and social standing. Skipping religious festivals is like announcing that your family doesn't respect the gods, which in ancient Egypt is roughly equivalent to professional suicide. The Festival of Opet requires weeks of preparation and significant financial investment. You must weave special ceremonial clothing, prepare elaborate food offerings, and participate in processions that last for days in the brutal Egyptian heat. The festival celebrates the marriage of Amun and Mut, the king and queen of the gods, which means your participation is supposed to strengthen your own marriage through divine sympathy. In practice, it mostly strengthens your sunburn and depletes your household budget. Religious purity requirements govern every aspect of your daily life, from when you can touch certain objects to what you can eat during specific lunar phases. Menstruation renders you ritually unclean for days, during which you can't prepare food, participate in religious ceremonies, or engage in sexual relations. In a society where religious observance is constant and sexual availability is a marital obligation, monthly periods become logistical nightmares that require careful planning and discreet management. Pregnancy brings additional spiritual complications. You must avoid certain foods, activities, and locations that might attract malevolent supernatural attention. Iron objects can't touch your skin because they might interfere with the baby's development. You can't look directly at certain animals because they might transfer their characteristics to your unborn child. These restrictions limit your mobility and productivity during the months when you're already physically compromised by pregnancy. The birth process requires extensive spiritual preparation involving amulets, incantations, and ritual objects designed to protect both mother and child from supernatural threats. Birthing chambers get decorated with magical symbols and filled with protective amulets made from precious materials your family can't afford. The midwife who assists with delivery must be ritually purified and spiritually prepared, adding another layer of expense to an already dangerous process. If your child dies during birth or in infancy, a common occurrence in ancient Egypt, the spiritual implications are devastating. Child death is interpreted as evidence of divine displeasure, ritual impurity, or supernatural attack. Your neighbours begin questioning what you've done to anger the gods. Your husband's family starts evaluating whether you're spiritually contaminated in ways that might affect future pregnancies. The elaborate funeral requirements for deceased infants add insult to injury during your grief. Even babies who lived for only days require proper mummification, burial goods, and religious ceremonies to ensure their safe passage to the afterlife. These expenses can bankrupt families already struggling with basic survival, but skipping proper burial rites risks supernatural retaliation that might affect your remaining children. Magic and medicine blend together in ways that make treating illness a spiritual minefield. Your local priest functions as both religious authority and medical practitioner, prescribing treatments that combine herbal remedies with magical incantations. Questioning the spiritual component of medical treatment suggests doubt about divine power, which could result in social ostracism or accusations of impiety. Love spells and fertility magic represent the intersection of religious practice and marital desperation. When your marriage encounters problems or your reproductive performance disappoints, family members pressure you to seek magical solutions. These remedies range from wearing specific amulets to consuming potions made from questionable ingredients like crushed scarab beetles and menstrual blood. The effectiveness of these treatments is roughly equivalent to modern homeopathy, but significantly more disgusting. Your spiritual education consists primarily of learning which gods to appease for specific problems and how to recognize signs of divine displeasure. Bread that molds too quickly indicates angry household gods. Livestock that dies unexpectedly suggests inadequate offerings to protective deities. Marriages that produce only daughters are clear evidence of spiritual problems requiring immediate correction through increased religious devotion and expanded ritual observance. The most terrifying aspect of religious obligation in marriage is the unpredictability of divine justice. Ancient Egyptian gods are portrayed as moody, easily offended, and prone to collective punishment that affects entire families for individual transgression. Your failure to maintain proper ritual purity could result in supernatural retaliation against your children. Your husband's business problems might be attributed to your inadequate devotion to household deities. As you kneel before your modest shrine to Bez, offering a portion of bread you can barely spare, while praying for protection from supernatural threats you can't see or understand, the religious dimensions of ancient Egyptian marriage reveal their true brutality. You're held spiritually responsible for forces beyond your control, while lacking the education, resources, or authority to effectively fulfill your divine obligations. The intersection of religion and daily marital life creates a spiritual surveillance state where every domestic action carries potential supernatural consequences, and you're constantly being evaluated by invisible divine auditors who might decide to smite your entire family for improper bread offerings or inadequate shrine maintenance. Your religious education as a married woman consists largely of learning to navigate an impossibly complex system of taboos, obligations, and seasonal restrictions that change based on lunar cycles, religious festivals, and the arbitrary whims of local priests who interpret divine will with the consistency of weather patterns. Breaking these rules isn't just socially embarrassing, it's considered spiritually dangerous for your entire extended family. The concept of Ma'at, cosmic order and justice, governs every aspect of your marriage with the subtlety of a granite sledgehammer. Your role as a wife is to maintain Ma'at within your household through proper conduct, ritual observance, and moral behaviour. This sounds reasonable until you realise that proper conduct includes dozens of daily requirements that conflict with practical survival needs and basic human psychology. Morning prayers must be completed before sunrise, which means waking up in complete darkness to recite incantations to household gods while your family sleeps. Missing morning prayers due to illness, exhaustion, or emergency situations indicates spiritual negligence that could anger the Jial and bring misfortune to your household. The gods apparently don't recognise sick days or compassionate leave policies. Food preparation becomes a religious minefield where every ingredient, cooking method, and serving arrangement carries spiritual significance. Certain foods can't be prepared during specific lunar phases. Others require ritual purification before consumption. Mixing ingredients in the wrong order might offend particular deities, while using contaminated cooking vessels could spiritually pollute your family's meals and attract supernatural punishment. The bread you bake daily must be offered to household gods before your family can eat it, which means setting aside portions of food you can barely spare while hoping the gods appreciate your sacrifice more than you're hungry. Children appreciate the reduced rations. Ancient Egyptian deities are apparently immune to economic hardship and don't adjust their offering requirements based on harvest yields or family circumstances. Sexual relations within marriage are regulated by religious calendar that makes modern tax codes look simple by comparison. Certain days of the month are considered spiritually dangerous for conception. Others are believed to influence the gender, health, and spiritual status of children conceived during those periods. Your intimate life becomes subject to celestial scheduling that treats spontaneous affection as spiritually reckless behaviour. Religious festivals throughout the year require your participation in elaborate ceremonies that consume time, energy, and resources you don't have. The Festival of the Dead demands offerings to deceased family members who might otherwise return to haunt the living. The Festival of Renewal requires ritual purification ceremonies that involve expensive materials and days of preparation. Missing these obligations suggests spiritual negligence that could affect your family's standing in both divine and human communities. Pregnancy transforms you into a walking religious ritual requiring constant spiritual maintenance. You must wear specific amulets to protect the developing child from supernatural threats. Your diet becomes restricted by religious prohibitions that eliminate foods considered spiritually dangerous during pregnancy. Even your physical activities are limited by beliefs about which actions might attract malevolent divine attention to your unborn child. The spiritual preparation for childbirth involves rituals that make the actual delivery seem simple by comparison. Your birthing chamber must be purified with incense and decorated with protective symbols drawn in expensive materials. The midwife requires spiritual cleansing before attending to you. Even the tools used during delivery must be ritually blessed to prevent supernatural contamination that could harm you or your child. Infant care extends religious obligations into every aspect of child rearing. Naming ceremonies must occur at astrologically appropriate times, determined by priests who charge fees for their calendrical expertise. Protection amulets must be created using materials that cost more than your family's monthly food budget. Even diaper changes require attention to ritual purity requirements that make basic childcare spiritually exhausting. Religious healing practices blur the line between medicine and magic in ways that make treating illness a theological exercise. When you develop health problems, and you will, given the physical demands of ancient Egyptian marriage, the prescribed treatments combine herbal remedies with magical incantations, ritual purification, and offerings to specific healing deities. Questioning the spiritual component of medical treatment suggests doubt about divine power, which could worsen your condition through supernatural retaliation. The economic burden of religious obligations adds another layer of hardship to already difficult circumstances. Priests require payment for their services, temples demand offerings for their maintenance, and religious festivals consume resources that could otherwise support your family's survival. Your spiritual obligations compete directly with your physical needs, creating impossible choices between divine approval and basic sustenance. Magic becomes the primary tool for managing marital problems that can't be solved through practical means. When your husband becomes distant, you consult magical specialists who prescribe love spells involving exotic ingredients and elaborate rituals. When your reproductive performance disappoints, you seek fertility magic that promises supernatural intervention in exchange for offerings you can't afford. These magical solutions rarely work, but desperate circumstances make even unlikely remedies seem worth attempting. The most insidious aspect of religious obligation in marriage is how it transforms personal failures into spiritual crimes that threaten your entire community. If your marriage produces only daughters, it's interpreted as evidence of divine displeasure that might affect your neighbour's fertility. If your children die in infancy, it suggests spiritual contamination that could spread to other families. Your personal struggles become community problems requiring collective religious intervention. As you complete your evening prayers while your husband discusses tomorrow's work and your children sleep on reed mats nearby, the religious dimensions of ancient Egyptian marriage reveal their ultimate cruelty. They transform the natural difficulties of life into spiritual failures that require constant attention, endless resources, and perfect compliance with divine rules that change without notice and can't be appealed through human authority. The supernatural politics of ancient Egyptian marriage extend far beyond your household shrine to encompass a vast network of competing deities, rival magic practitioners, and religious authorities who treat your personal struggles as opportunities for spiritual intervention, usually for a fee that exceeds your family's annual income. When your marriage encounters serious problems, infertility, domestic violence, financial ruin, or chronic illness, the religious establishment offers solutions that make modern medical billing look straightforward. Every spiritual remedy requires consultation fees, ritual materials, ceremonial offerings, and ongoing maintenance payments that transform your marital crisis into a long-term religious subscription service. The diagnostic process for spiritual problems involves priests who examine your household for evidence of divine displeasure, supernatural contamination, or ritual negligence that might explain your difficulties. These spiritual audits reveal violations you didn't know existed. Your shrine orientation is 5 degrees off the cardinal directions, your offering bowls contain microscopic chips that offend particular deities, or your menstrual purification rituals have been inadequately thorough for the past 6 months. Correcting these spiritual deficiencies requires expensive remediation that often exceeds the cost of building a new house. Sacred materials must be imported from specific locations blessed by particular gods. Purification ceremonies require rare incense that costs more than your annual grain ration. Even the labour involved in spiritual correction must be performed by religiously qualified workers who charge premium rates for their sanctified services. The competitive nature of ancient Egyptian religion means that different priests often prescribe contradictory solutions for the same marital problems. One temple recommends increased offerings to Hathor, the goddess of love and fertility. Another suggests elaborate rituals to appease Sobek, the crocodile god who controls the Nile's fertility-bringing floods. A third insists that your problems stem from inadequate devotion to local household spirits who require completely different ceremonial approaches. These conflicting religious prescriptions create spiritual politics that make modern denominational disputes look like friendly theological discussions. Choosing the wrong priest or following inappropriate ritual advice could offend competing deities who then escalate your marital problems through supernatural retaliation. You're essentially navigating religious warfare where the wrong decision transforms minor domestic difficulties into cosmic conflicts involving multiple divine factions. The magical marketplace that surrounds troubled marriages operates like an ancient Egyptian version of alternative medicine, complete with practitioners who promise miraculous cures using secret knowledge passed down through generations of spiritual specialists. Love magic, fertility enhancement, supernatural protection, and divine intervention are all available for the right price and with appropriate discretion. These magical services range from relatively harmless amulet creation to dangerous rituals involving toxic substances, illegal activities, and supernatural practices that could result in social ostracism or criminal prosecution if discovered. Desperate wives resort to increasingly extreme magical interventions as conventional religious approaches fail to solve their marital problems. The black market for reproductive magic includes contraceptive spells for wives trying to avoid potentially fatal pregnancies, abortion rituals for those who become pregnant despite preventive measures, and fertility magic for women whose reproductive performance disappoints their families. These services operate in legal grey areas, where getting caught could result in divorce, social disgrace, or accusations of practicing harmful magic against family members. Supernatural warfare between wives sharing the same household creates a parallel economy of offensive and defensive magic designed to sabotage rival relationships while protecting one's own interests. Curses intended to cause miscarriages, love spells designed to redirect husbands' affections, and protection rituals meant to deflect magical attacks from jealous co-wives transform polygamous households into battlefields of competing supernatural interventions. The religious authorities who profit from marital chaos have little incentive to actually solve the problems they're consulted about. Successful magical intervention eliminates the need for ongoing services, while failure creates opportunities for additional consultations, revised prescriptions, and expanded ritual requirements. The spiritual economy benefits from chronic problems that require continuous management rather than definitive solutions. Religious interpretation of marital difficulties often blames the victims for their circumstances while prescribing remedies that worsen their situations. Wives who suffer domestic violence are told that their spiritual conduct has angered protective deities. Women who experience reproductive difficulties are advised to increase their devotional activities while their health deteriorates from overwork and malnutrition. The religious establishment transforms personal suffering into opportunities for expanded spiritual control and financial exploitation. The documentation of religious compliance creates permanent records that follow you throughout your marriage and beyond. Priests maintain detailed accounts of your offerings, ritual participation, and spiritual conduct that affect your family's religious standing and social reputation. Poor religious performance ratings can impact your children's marriage prospects, your husband's business relationships, and your family's access to community resources during emergencies. Religious law intersects with secular legal systems in ways that make divorce, inheritance, and property disputes subject to priestly interpretation and divine approval. Judges consult religious authorities about the spiritual implications of legal decisions. Business contracts include religious clauses that invoke divine punishment for violations. Even simple domestic arrangements require religious blessing to be considered valid and binding. The ultimate spiritual threat facing troubled marriages is excommunication from religious community, social death that makes physical survival nearly impossible in ancient Egyptian society. Families who fall out of religious favour lose access to temple resources, community support networks, and the spiritual protection that ancient Egyptians consider essential for navigating supernatural dangers that surround daily life. As you kneel in your darkened house, offering prayers to gods who seem increasingly distant while priests demand payment for spiritual services you can't afford, and magical practitioners promise solutions that never materialize, the religious dimensions of ancient Egyptian marriage reveal their final brutality. They transform your natural human struggles into supernatural problems that require constant divine intervention you can't afford, don't understand, and have no way to verify or control. The collapse of an ancient Egyptian marriage doesn't happen dramatically, like a building crumbling in an earthquake. It deteriorates gradually, like a mud brick wall slowly dissolving in seasonal floods, until one day you wake up and realise the structure that was supposed to protect you has become a trap threatening to bury you alive. Your marriage begins its death spiral during the 3rd year, when it becomes painfully obvious that your reproductive performance isn't meeting expectations. You've produced one daughter, beautiful, healthy, intelligent, but she's not the male heir your husband's family invested in when they agreed to your marriage contract. The whispered conversations behind your back grow louder, more frequent, and decidedly less subtle. Your mother-in-law starts making pointed comments about fertility herbs and suggesting visits to expensive magical practitioners who specialise in gender determination spells. Your husband begins working longer hours in the fields, staying away from the house during times when marital intimacy might be expected. His avoidance isn't cruel, it's strategic. He's already calculating the costs and benefits of replacing you with a younger, potentially more productive wife. The household economics shift as resources get redirected toward acquiring a second wife. Your food rations decrease slightly, nothing dramatic enough to justify complaint, but sufficient to communicate your declining status within the family hierarchy. The good linen gets reserved for special occasions when your husband needs to impress potential in-laws. Your daily clothing becomes increasingly threadbare as textile production focuses on items that will showcase the family's prosperity to prospective marriage partners. The emotional distance between you and your husband expands like a crack in a limestone foundation. Conversations become purely functional, discussions about grain storage, work assignments and childcare logistics. The casual physical affection that characterised your early marriage disappears entirely. You sleep on opposite sides of your shared sleeping mat, careful not to accidentally touch in ways that might be interpreted as invitations to intimacy that could result in another non-male pregnancy. Your daughter becomes a painful reminder of your reproductive failure every time you look at her. She's perfect in every way except the most important one. She lacks the specific chromosomal configuration that would secure your position in the family. You love her desperately, while simultaneously resenting the cosmic unfairness that makes her existence evidence of your inadequacy as a wife. The introduction of your husband's second wife transforms your household from a struggling but functional unit into a battlefield where every resource, every privilege, and every moment of attention becomes contested territory. Halima arrives with a dowry that includes items you haven't seen since your own wedding, new copper cookware, fine linen dresses, and jewellery that makes your remaining possessions look shabby by comparison. She's 15 years old, 5 years younger than you, with smooth skin, bright eyes, and the kind of energetic optimism that you remember having before marriage taught you that hope is a luxury ancient Egyptian wives can't afford. Her presence makes you feel ancient, worn out, and dispensable. She approaches household tasks with enthusiasm that highlights your own growing exhaustion and resentment. The sleeping arrangements require diplomatic skills that would challenge modern United Nations negotiators. Your husband attempts to divide his time equitably between 2 wives, but equality in a 2-room house means everyone's privacy disappears entirely. You listen to intimate sounds from the other side of a thin curtain, while trying to pretend that your heart isn't breaking and your pride isn't being systematically demolished. Halima's pregnancy is announced during your 4th month of trying to conceive your own second child. The timing isn't coincidental. Her fertility demonstrates everything yours apparently lacks. The household celebration for her condition contrasts sharply with the anxiety that surrounded your own pregnancies. Your mother-in-law fusses over Halima's diet, ensures she gets adequate rest, and provides herbal supplements that she never offered during your own pregnancies. The gender reveal comes through a pregnancy test involving urine and grain seeds, the same diagnostic method that correctly predicted your daughter's gender. When the barley grows more vigorously than the wheat, everyone celebrates the predicted male heir that will secure Halima's position and confirm your obsolescence. The mathematical precision of your replacement has been calculated with devastating accuracy. Your relationship with your daughter becomes complicated by the household's shifting dynamics. She's old enough to understand that mommy is being replaced by the younger woman who gets better food, prettier clothes, and daddy's attention. Your attempts to shield her from adult politics fail as she observes the daily evidence of your declining status and begins adjusting her own behaviour to align with the new hierarchy. The birth of Halima's son transforms your status from primary wife to expensive burden in a single afternoon. The celebration that greets his arrival contrasts painfully with the polite acknowledgement that accompanied your daughter's birth. Your husband's joy is genuine and infectious. He has the male heir he's wanted, and the younger wife who produced him suddenly becomes the family's most valuable asset. Your attempts to maintain dignity while navigating this new reality require emotional strength you're not sure you possess. Daily life becomes a careful performance where you must appear gracious and supportive while your heart breaks a little more each day. Expressing jealousy, resentment, or hurt feelings would confirm that you're the kind of woman who can't handle polygamous marriage gracefully, another mark against your suitability as a wife. The practical implications of your changed status emerge gradually but relentlessly. You get assigned the less desirable household tasks while Halima handles food preparation and entertaining. Your clothing allowance gets reduced while hers increases. Your opinions carry less weight in family decisions while her preferences receive serious consideration. The woman who produces male heirs gets treated like a valuable asset. The woman who doesn't becomes an expensive liability requiring strategic management. As you watch your husband play with his son while your daughter sits quietly in the corner, trying to understand why her father seems less interested in her than in the baby, you realise that the collapse of your ancient Egyptian marriage isn't a single catastrophic event. It's a slow-moving disaster that dissolves your identity, your security, and your future one grain of sand at a time until nothing remains but the memory of what you once hoped your life might become. The legal machinery of divorce in ancient Egypt operates with the efficiency of a grain mill. It grinds everything you put into it into powder, and you're usually the grain getting crushed between the stones of male authority and economic necessity. Your husband approaches the subject of divorce with the sensitivity of a tax collector, presenting it as a practical business decision rather than the emotional devastation it represents. He's consulted with legal experts, discussed the financial implications with his family, and calculated the costs of maintaining two wives versus the benefits of replacing you with someone who might produce multiple male heirs. The mathematics of your disposal have been worked out in advance. The grounds for your divorce are presented as mutual incompatibility rather than your specific failure to produce male children, because framing it as a no-fault dissolution protects your husband's reputation as a reasonable man, making difficult but necessary decisions. Ancient Egyptian society recognizes that some marriages simply don't work out, and ending them amicably demonstrates mature judgment rather than poor character. Your marriage contract, which you couldn't read when you signed it and barely understood when it was explained to you, now becomes the legal framework for dismantling your life. Every clause that seemed like abstract legal language transforms into practical consequences that affect where you'll live, what you'll own, and how you'll survive after your husband decides you're no longer cost-effective. The property division process reveals how little you actually control, despite technically owning assets. Your dowry items have been integrated into household inventory for years, making it difficult to determine which possessions are legally yours versus communally owned. The bronze mirror you brought to the marriage has been shared with other household members. The linen dresses have been worn by your husband's female relatives during festivals. Your silver rings have been used as collateral for business loans. Recovering your property requires negotiations between your father and your husband, assuming your father is still alive and financially capable of advocating on your behalf. If he's deceased or impoverished, your brothers might represent your interests, but they have their own families and economic pressures that make recovering your dowry a lower priority than maintaining good relationships with your husband's family for future business dealings. The legal proceedings happen around you rather than with your direct participation. Your husband and your father, assuming he's still alive and willing to get involved, negotiate the terms of your disposal like merchants haggling over damaged grain. The conversation centers on property recovery, financial obligations, and the logistics of removing you from a household where you've lived for years, but apparently never truly belonged. Ancient Egyptian divorce law, surprisingly progressive for its time, theoretically protects your interests through mandatory property settlements and financial compensation. In practice, however, these protections work about as effectively as a papyrus umbrella in a sandstorm. Your husband must return your dowry and pay additional compensation, but only if he can afford it, and only if your family has enough legal knowledge to enforce these requirements. The compensation formula sounds generous in theory. Your husband owes you 1/3 of all property acquired during the marriage, plus penalty payments that can reach 5 to 10 times your original dowry value. In practice, determining what constitutes marital property becomes an exercise in creative accounting that would impress modern tax attorneys. That cooking pot you both use daily, was it technically yours from your dowry, his from before marriage, or jointly acquired? The answer depends on whose legal representative argues more persuasively. Your personal belongings, scattered throughout the household after years of communal living, must be identified and reclaimed. The bronze mirror you brought to marriage has tarnished from shared use. The linen dresses have been altered, borrowed by relatives, or worn threadbare from daily wear. Your silver rings have been used as collateral for business loans that may or may not have been repaid. Recovering your property feels less like reclaiming assets and more like archaeological excavation. The most brutal aspect of ancient Egyptian divorce isn't the legal complexity, it's the social transformation that occurs the moment your marriage officially dissolves. Yesterday you were a wife with defined status and social connections. Today you're a divorced woman, a category that exists in legal limbo between maiden and widow, with none of the protections afforded to either group. Your living situation becomes immediately precarious. Egyptian divorce law requires you to leave the conjugal home regardless of who initiated the proceedings. You become homeless by legal definition, even if the house contains possessions you technically own and children you've raised from birth. Your husband retains custody of the residence while you face the prospect of returning to your birth family like a damaged merchandise being returned to its original seller. The children complicate everything beyond repair. Ancient Egyptian law generally favours maternal custody, especially for young children, but practical enforcement depends on the circumstances beyond legal precedent. Your daughter legally belongs with you, but if your father's house lacks space or resources to support additional dependents, she might remain with her father simply because his household can better afford her upkeep. Love and attachment become secondary considerations to economic logistics. Your son, if you had managed to produce one, would almost certainly remain with his father's family line regardless of your circumstances or preferences. Male children represent future economic assets and family continuation. Removing a boy from his paternal inheritance would be considered economic sabotage rather than maternal right. You lose your children not through legal ruling, but through systematic economic pressure that makes alternative arrangements impossible. The social stigma of divorce in ancient Egypt is complicated and contradictory. Theoretically, divorced women face no particular shame. Divorce is recognised as a normal part of life that happens when marriages fail for practical reasons. In practice, however, your status as a divorced woman makes you simultaneously more independent and more vulnerable than you've ever been. Marriage proposals from other men become rare and problematic. Your proven fertility might seem attractive, but your demonstrated inability to maintain a marriage suggests character flaws that potential husbands prefer to avoid. Your advanced age, you're now in your mid-20s, practically elderly by ancient Egyptian standards, makes you less appealing than younger alternatives who haven't been worn down by previous reproductive cycles. The economic realities of single life in ancient Egypt are harsh enough to make bad marriages seem preferable by comparison. Employment opportunities for women are limited and poorly compensated. You might find work as a domestic servant, textile worker or market vendor, but these occupations provide subsistence-level income that leaves no margin for emergencies, illness or old age planning. Your former in-laws, who once treated you as family, now regard you with the polite distance reserved for business associates whose contracts have been terminated. The neighbourhood women who once shared gossip and domestic advice now view you as cautionary tale about what happens when wives fail to maintain their husband's satisfaction. Your social network dissolves along with your marriage, leaving you isolated precisely when you most need community support. As you pack your few remaining possessions into bundles that can be carried by hand, preparing to leave the only home your daughter has ever known, the mathematical precision of your replacement becomes clear. Halima has already moved into the sleeping space you once occupied, her younger body fitting seamlessly into the domestic routines you developed over years of marriage. Your husband's life continues with minimal disruption, while yours faces complete reconstruction from a position of social and economic disadvantage that makes failure virtually inevitable. The final dissolution of your ancient Egyptian marriage doesn't end with dramatic confrontation or emotional breakdown. It concludes with the quiet efficiency of inventory management, as if your years together were nothing more than a failed business venture, requiring orderly liquidation before moving on to more profitable endeavours. Your last night in the house where you've lived as a wife passes in sleepless anxiety punctuated by the sounds of normal domestic life continuing around you. Halima moves through evening routines with the confidence of someone who has already claimed at your former territory. Your husband discusses grain storage with his brother, in the same tone he once used to plan your future together. Your daughter sleeps fitfully beside you, sensing the household tension without understanding its implications for her own security. The morning brings practical details that transform emotional devastation into administrative tasks. Your father arrives with a borrowed donkey, and expressions of resignation that make clear he's doing his duty rather than welcoming you home with enthusiasm. His household budget was balanced for his current family size. Adding 2 additional dependents creates financial strain that everyone pretends not to discuss while calculating its impact on daily meals and sleeping arrangements. Your possessions, sorted into bundles during the night, look pathetically small when loaded onto the donkey. Years of marriage have been reduced to a few cloth-wrapped packages that barely fill the animal's carrying capacity. The bronze mirror shows your reflection fractured through cracks that appeared during packing, a metaphor so obvious it would be laughable if laughing didn't hurt so much. The neighbourhood witnesses your departure with the fascinated attention usually reserved for public entertainment. Divorced women leaving their marriage but now seem like reasonable adjustments to market realities. Your dowry, already reduced by the previous divorce settlements, consists primarily of your labour commitment and childcare expertise rather than material assets. Ancient Egyptian second marriages operate on different economic principles that prioritise practical utility over symbolic value or romantic sentiment. Your wedding ceremony, if it can be called that, consists of moving your possessions to Katie's house during a single afternoon, while his children watch with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. There's no celebration, no community feast, no religious blessing, just the practical arrangement of combining 2 struggling households into one slightly more viable economic unit. Ancient Egypt recognises remarriage as administrative necessity rather than joyful occasion. The domestic reality of your new situation becomes apparent within hours of arrival. 6 children have been managing themselves with minimal supervision for months, developing survival strategies that don't include accommodating adult authority figures they don't know or trust. Their mother's death left them emotionally damaged in ways that manifest as behavioural problems requiring patience and skills you've never needed to develop. The oldest daughter, Nefertiti, has assumed maternal responsibility for her younger siblings, with the fierce protectiveness of someone who's learned that adults can't be trusted to provide consistent care. She views your arrival as potential threat to her authority rather than helpful assistance with overwhelming responsibilities. Her resistance to your domestic management suggestions creates household tension that affects every daily routine from meal preparation to bedtime supervision. The middle children aged between 8 and 4 have formed alliances and developed attention-seeking behaviours that make normal household activities feel like diplomatic negotiations between hostile tribes. They compete for your attention while simultaneously testing your commitment to staying in their lives permanently. Their emotional needs exceed your capacity to address while managing practical household requirements and caring for your own daughter's adjustment difficulties. The baby, now 8 months old and still motherless, requires constant attention that prevents you from addressing other pressing household needs. His feeding schedule, complicated by his refusal to accept food from unfamiliar sources, disrupts every attempt to establish routine meal preparation. His sleep patterns, disturbed by anxiety about abandonment, make rest impossible for everyone in the house. His developmental delays, caused by inadequate early care, suggest problems that might require long-term specialised attention. Your husband's approach to remarriage reflects his view of wives as domestic employees rather than family partners. He expects immediate improvement in household management, about survival and future security. Sleep becomes elusive as your mind cycles through alternative scenarios, that might have prevented this outcome. If you had conceived a son earlier, if you had been more accepting of polygamy, if you had managed household resources more efficiently, the list of potential different decisions grows longer each night, while providing no actual comfort or solutions for your current circumstances. The legal aftermath of divorce continues for months as property disputes, child custody arrangements, and financial obligations get resolved through negotiations between male family representatives. You participate in these proceedings primarily as evidence, rather than participant, present to verify details about household possessions and marital circumstances, but excluded from actual decision-making about your future. Your former husband's life moves forward with remarkable speed and efficiency. Within months, he has effectively forgotten your existence except when legal matters require his attention to finalise remaining administrative details. His household operates smoothly under Halima's management, proving that your years of domestic labour were neither irreplaceable nor particularly valued beyond their functional utility. As you watch the sun sail over the Nile from your father's cramped courtyard, holding your daughter while she sleeps and listening to adult conversations about household budgets and marriage prospects that don't include your opinions, you understand the final cruelty of ancient Egyptian marriage. It's designed to make women so dependent on male protection that even terrible marriages seem preferable to the alternative of independence that isn't actually independent at all, but merely transfers your dependence from one male authority figure to another, usually older and less economically capable one. You've been divorced for 6 months now, and the novelty of your situation has worn off like cheap dye in river water. What remains is the grinding daily reality of existing in ancient Egyptian society as a woman without a husband, which is roughly equivalent to being a boat without oars in a crocodile-infested canal. Technically possible, but not recommended for long-term survival. Your father's house, which initially seemed like a sanctuary from marital disaster, has revealed itself to be a different type of prison entirely. The walls haven't changed since your childhood, but your perspective has. What once felt cosy now feels suffocating. The cooking area where you once helped your mother now accommodates too many women with overlapping responsibilities and competing ideas about proper food preparation. The sleeping space that held fond childhood memories now barely contains the adults, and children packed into arrangements that would make sardines claustrophobic. Your stepmother's initial politeness has eroded into barely concealed resentment that makes every household interaction feel like diplomatic negotiations between hostile nations. She measures the grain you consume, counts the water you draw from the well, and calculates the costs of your presence with the precision of a royal accountant. Her smiles have become as genuine as painted tomb decorations, technically present but clearly artificial. Your economic contributions to the household help but don't solve the fundamental mathematical problem. Your family can't afford to support you indefinitely, and you can't afford to support yourself independently. The textile work you do generates some income, but ancient Egyptian women's wages barely cover individual survival needs, let alone family support. Your fingers, already damaged from years of domestic labour, develop new calluses and joint problems from increased weaving work that brings diminishing returns as your output competes with younger, faster workers in an oversupplied market. The social dynamics of extended family living create tensions that escalate slowly but inevitably, like water building up behind a weak dam. Your presence disrupts established household routines and sleeping arrangements. Your daughter's needs compete with those of your father's other children for resources and attention. Your emotional state, grief, anger, disappointment and fear cycling through daily like unwelcome weather patterns, affects the household atmosphere in ways that everyone feels but no one discusses directly. Your daughter's adjustment to this new reality provides daily heartbreak disguised as normal childhood behaviour. She asks when you'll return to the house where Daddy lives, whether Halima is her new mother, and if the baby brother she was developing attachment to will remember her if they don't see each other for a long time. Each innocent question feels like emotional shrapnel, small wounds that accumulate into larger damage over time. The neighbourhood children, with the casual cruelty that makes childhood survivable, have begun referring to your daughter as the divorce girl, a label that follows her like an unwanted shadow. Ancient Egyptian society theoretically treats divorced women's children without stigma, but children's social hierarchies operate by different rules that include a divorce status as a mark of family instability and economic weakness. Your own social status has become ambiguous in ways that create daily awkwardness. You're too old to be treated as an unmarried maiden, too financially unstable to be respected as an independent woman, and too recently divorced to be viewed as a potential wife by most men. You exist in social limbo that makes casual interactions complicated and formal social events nearly impossible to navigate successfully. The marriage proposals that do arrive come from men whose circumstances make your own situation look attractive by comparison. Widowers with multiple young children seeking unpaid domestic help, elderly men looking for younger wives to care for them in declining years, or divorced men whose previous marriages ended under circumstances that make them undesirable to women with better options. These proposals feel less like romantic opportunities and more like business arrangements, where you provide labour in exchange for basic survival support. Your physical health has begun deteriorating under the stress of economic insecurity and emotional trauma. Ancient Egyptian medicine doesn't recognise depression or anxiety as medical conditions requiring treatment. Your symptoms, difficulty sleeping, loss of appetite, frequent headaches and general fatigue, are attributed to spiritual problems or moral weakness, rather than psychological response to impossible circumstances. The remedies prescribed involve increased religious devotion and herbal treatments that address supposed physical ailments, rather than underlying emotional causes. The seasonal rhythms that once structured your year around agricultural cycles and religious festivals now feel arbitrary and disconnected from your daily reality. Flood season brings anxiety about household resources, rather than hopeful anticipation of renewed fertility. Harvest time reminds you of economic security you once took for granted, rather than celebrating abundance and community cooperation. Religious festivals become occasions for social comparison and family tension, rather than spiritual renewal and communal celebration. Your relationship with your father has become complicated by circumstances neither of you anticipated when he agreed to take you back into his household. He loves you as his daughter, but resents the financial burden you represent. He wants to protect you from further hardship, but lacks resources to provide meaningful security. His own marriage faces stress from overcrowding and economic pressure that your presence creates, forcing him to choose between competing loyalties to different family members. Your memories of married life have begun shifting from bitter disappointment to nostalgic longing for the security and social recognition that marriage provided, despite its obvious problems and ultimate failure. The daily routine of being someone's wife, even an unappreciated and eventually discarded wife, seems appealing compared to the uncertainty and social ambiguity of your current situation. This psychological shift toward romanticizing your former circumstances suggests that the system designed to make women dependent on marriage is working exactly as intended. As you lie on your sleeping mat, listening to your daughter's steady breathing, while adult conversations about household expenses continue in whispered tones nearby, you realize that ancient Egyptian divorce doesn't actually free women from marriage, it simply transforms them from unhappy wives into desperate candidates for remarriage under even less favorable circumstances than their original arrangements. The marriage proposals begin arriving with the predictables, regardless of what chaos erupts around him. Your own daughter's transformation from cooperative child to attention-seeking competitor breaks your heart while adding another layer of complexities to domestic management that already exceeds your capabilities. She's learned to create crises that force you to choose between her needs and those of her step-siblings, putting you in impossible positions where any decision results in someone feeling neglected and resentful. Her psychological regression to earlier developmental stages suggests stress levels that would concern any parent with time to address them properly. The baby's continued resistance to maternal bonding creates practical problems that affect every aspect of household functioning. His refusal to accept food from you consistently means that mealtimes become elaborate negotiations involving multiple people and backup plans. His inability to sleep through the night means that you're chronically exhausted while trying to manage complex household logistics that would challenge well-rested adults with fewer responsibilities. Ketty's evaluation of your performance as second wife compares unfavourably to idealised memories of his first marriage, which has achieved martyr-like status in his recollections that emphasises her domestic competence while minimising any problems or challenges she might have faced. His deceased wife becomes a standard of comparison that no living woman could meet, especially one dealing with circumstances she never encountered during her lifetime. The economic strain of supporting a larger household has forced budget cuts that affect nutrition, clothing, and basic maintenance in ways that create health problems requiring expensive solutions your family can't afford. The children's frequent illnesses, caused partly by inadequate food and overcrowded living conditions, require medical attention that consumes resources needed for basic survival. Ancient Egyptian healthcare for large families operates on triage principles that force parents to choose which problems can be addressed and which must be endured. Your physical deterioration accelerates under the constant demands of large family management combined with chronic sleep deprivation and inadequate nutrition. Your hands develop permanent calluses and joint problems from increased textile work needed to generate additional income. Your back aches constantly from lifting children and heavy household equipment. Your menstrual cycles become irregular due to stress and malnutrition, suggesting reproductive problems that could affect future pregnancy outcomes. The social isolation of your new marriage intensifies as community relationships become complicated by your association with a household that neighbours view as chaotic and possibly unstable. Other wives avoid close friendship with someone whose domestic situation might reflect poorly on their own competence or create obligations to provide assistance they can't. Children plus whatever offspring your new marriage might produce, managing a household that consumes significantly more resources than your previous marriage, and accepting a social position as replacement wife rather than beloved partner. In exchange, you receive economic security, social respectability, and the theoretical protection of male authority in a society that provides limited alternatives for divorced women. Your daughter's reaction to potentially acquiring 6 step siblings and a stepfather she's never met adds another layer of complexity to an already difficult decision. She's simultaneously excited by the prospect of having playmates and terrified of losing her position as your primary concern. Her questions about whether her new siblings will like her and whether you'll still have time to tell her bedtime stories reveal anxieties that would be heartbreaking if they weren't so practically relevant to her future well-being. The second proposal arrives from Seneb, a divorced man whose first marriage ended when his wife ran away with a travelling merchant, taking portable household goods and leaving behind substantial debts. His circumstances mirror your own closely enough to suggest compatibility, but his financial problems make the marriage proposal less attractive than initial appearances suggest. Marrying another economically struggling divorced person would combine 2 sets of problems, rather than solving either set effectively. Seneb's bitter commentary about his former wife's moral failings provides insight into his character that serves as warning rather than reassurance. His assumption that all women are potentially treacherous and require constant supervision suggests that remarriage to him would involve restrictions and suspicions that might make your current difficult circumstances seem preferable by comparison. Ancient Egyptian men who've been abandoned by wives often develop defensive strategies that make subsequent marriages feel more like imprisonment than partnership. The third proposal comes from Amenhotep, an elderly man whose advanced age and deteriorating health make him seek a younger wife primarily to provide care during his declining years. His offer includes inheritance promises that might provide future economic security in exchange for present domestic servitude that would essentially make you a live-in nurse rather than a wife. The arrangement might benefit your daughter's long-term prospects while sacrificing your own remaining productive years to caring for someone else's gradual deterioration. Each potential marriage presents variations on the same fundamental theme. Ancient Egyptian remarriage for divorced women involves accepting circumstances that are objectively worse than most first marriages because your negotiating position has been permanently weakened by your change in status. You're no longer a valuable asset being acquired by a family seeking advantages. You're a liability being assumed by men whose own circumstances make them desperate enough to overlook your obvious disadvantage. Your father's increasing pressure to accept one of these proposals reflects the mounting financial strain of supporting your extended residence in his household. His subtle comments about the generosity of some offers and the declining likelihood of receiving better alternatives create emotional pressure that makes decision-making feel less like personal choice and more like inevitable capitulation to economic necessity. The community's expectations about your remarriage timeline add social pressure to economic and familial concerns. Ancient Egyptian society expects divorced women to remarry promptly, interpreting extended single status as evidence of unrealistic standards or personal defects that make them unsuitable wives. Your continuing unmarried state begins generating gossip that could affect your daughter's future marriage prospects and your family's social reputation. As you weigh these dismal options while your father calculates household expenses and your daughter asks innocent questions about which potential stepfather might let her keep the stray cat she's been feeding, you realise that ancient Egyptian divorce doesn't provide women with freedom to choose better marriages. It forces them to accept progressively worse arrangements from positions of increasing desperation. The decision about remarriage transforms into a mathematical equation where all variables point toward the same inevitable conclusion. Your current situation is unsustainable, and every alternative carries costs that exceed your capacity to pay them. Ancient Egyptian society has constructed the system where divorced women face choices that aren't actually choices at all, but rather different methods of accepting defeat with varying degrees of dignity. Your father's patience, stretched thin by months of additional household expenses and social awkwardness, finally reaches its breaking point during a conversation about grain rations that becomes an argument about long-term family planning. His words, though spoken in frustration rather than cruelty, make the economic mathematics brutally clear. Supporting you and your daughter indefinitely will impoverish his entire household and potentially compromise his other children's marriage prospects and inheritance rights. The ultimatum, when it comes, is presented as loving concern rather than financial necessity. You have 2 months to accept one of the current marriage proposals, before he'll be forced to make arrangements that prioritise his obligations to his other dependents over his desire to help you. Ancient Egyptian family loyalty has limits that become apparent when resources become scarce and competing needs require difficult prioritization decisions. Your response to this deadline involves sleepless nights spent calculating the costs and benefits of each potential marriage against the terrifying alternative of complete economic independence in a society that provides minimal support for single women with children. The mathematics are depressing regardless of how you manipulate the variables. Every option requires sacrificing significant personal autonomy and accepting circumstances that would have seemed unthinkable during your first marriage. The prospect of marrying Keti and inheriting 6 children who need intensive care creates anxiety that manifests in physical symptoms. Your stomach churns when you imagine managing the household chaos you witnessed during your visit. Your head throbs when you calculate the resources required to feed, clothe, and supervise 7 children while maintaining domestic production and managing pregnancy cycles that Keti clearly expects to resume immediately. The workload would be crushing under optimal circumstances. With limited support and hostile stepchildren, it might literally kill you. Marrying Seneb offers fewer immediate responsibilities but greater long-term risks. His financial problems, combined with his obvious psychological damage from his first marriage's traumatic ending, suggest that remarriage would involve emotional volatility and economic instability that could leave you worse off than your current circumstances. Ancient Egyptian men who've been betrayed by wives often develop controlling behaviours that make subsequent marriages feel more like supervised captivity than domestic partnership. The arrangement with Amenhotep provides the clearest transaction. Your remaining productive years in exchange for potential inheritance rights and immediate economic security. The appeal of this option lies in its honest acknowledgement that remarriage at your age and circumstances involves caregiving rather than romantic partnership. The disadvantage involves accepting a future that consists entirely of nursing an increasingly sick old man, while your own health deteriorates from constant service to someone else's needs. Your daughter's input, sought through carefully phrased questions about her preferences regarding potential new living situations, reveals her own psychological adaptation to circumstances beyond her control. She prefers the household with other children despite recognizing the chaos it would create, because her 4-year-old mind craves social interaction more than domestic tranquility. Her innocent preference for playmates over practical stability adds another consideration to an already complex decision matrix. The community's reaction to your prolonged decision-making process begins shifting from patient understanding to judgmental criticism. Ancient Egyptian society interprets extended deliberation about marriage proposals as evidence of unrealistic expectations or moral deficiency that makes women unsuitable wives. Neighbours who once offered sympathetic support now provide unsolicited advice about the dangers of becoming too particular when circumstances limit available options. Your physical appearance has begun reflecting the stress of prolonged uncertainty, and inadequate nutrition. Ancient Egyptian beauty standards emphasize healthy appearance as evidence of proper spiritual condition and family care. Your declining looks, visible in the bronze mirror's honest reflection, reduce your attractiveness to potential husbands, while simultaneously suggesting to community observers that your circumstances are affecting your moral and spiritual condition. The religious implications of your situation add another layer of pressure to practical considerations. Ancient Egyptian spiritual beliefs interpret prolonged misfortune as evidence of divine displeasure, requiring correction through proper behavior and social conformity. Your inability to secure remarriage quickly enough to satisfy community expectations suggests spiritual problems that might affect your family's relationship with protective deities and community religious standing. Your relationship with your daughter has become complicated by the knowledge that your decisions about remarriage will determine her future circumstances more dramatically than your own. Her childhood development depends on stability and security that you currently cannot provide independently. Your maternal instincts conflict with your personal preferences in ways that make decision-making feel like choosing between different methods of self-sacrifice rather than selecting preferred alternatives. The final factor, forcing your decision, involves your health, which has deteriorated visibly during months of stress and inadequate nutrition. Ancient Egyptian women in their mid-20s are already approaching the end of their optimal reproductive years. Delaying remarriage further reduces your attractiveness to potential husbands, while increasing the likelihood that future pregnancy complications could kill you before your daughter reaches independence. As you sit in the courtyard watching your daughter play with clay dolls while your father discusses household budgets with your stepmother, in voices pitched low enough to suggest serious concern, you realize that the ancient Egyptian marriage system has succeeded in its primary objective, making women so economically and socially vulnerable that even terrible marriages seem preferable to alternatives that don't actually provide viable independence. You choose Keti, not because his proposal offers the best circumstances, but because his immediate need for domestic help provides the fastest escape from your father's increasingly strained hospitality. The decision feels less like selecting a husband, and more like choosing which form of exhaustion you're prepared to accept in exchange for social respectability and economic security that might last longer than your physical capacity to earn them. The marriage contract negotiated between Keti and your father reflects your diminished status in ways that would have been humiliating during your first marriage but now seem like reasonable adjustments to market realities. Your dowry, already reduced by the previous divorce settlements, consists primarily of your labour commitment and childcare expertise rather than material assets. Ancient Egyptian second marriages operate on different economic principles that prioritise practical utility over symbolic value or romantic sentiment. Your wedding ceremony, if it can be called that, consists of moving your possessions to Keti's house during a single afternoon, while his children watch with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. There's no celebration, no community feast, no religious blessing, just the practical arrangement of combining two struggling households into one slightly more viable economic unit. Ancient Egypt recognizes remarriage as administrative necessity rather than joyful occasion. The domestic reality of your new situation becomes apparent within hours of arrival. 6 children have been managing themselves with minimal supervision for months, developing survival strategies that don't include accommodating adult authority figures they don't know or trust. Their mother's death left them emotionally damaged in ways that manifest as behavioral problems requiring patience and skills you've never needed to develop. The oldest daughter, Nefertiti, has assumed maternal responsibility for her younger siblings, with the fierce protectiveness of someone who's learned that adults can't be trusted to provide consistent care. She views your arrival as potential threat to her authority rather than helpful assistance with overwhelming responsibilities. Her resistance to your domestic management suggestions creates household tension that affects every daily routine from meal preparation to bedtime supervision. The middle children aged between 8 and 4 have formed alliances and developed attention-seeking behaviours that make normal household activities feel like diplomatic negotiations between hostile tribes. They compete for your attention while simultaneously testing your commitment to staying in their lives permanently. Their emotional needs exceed your capacity to address while managing practical household requirements and caring for your own daughter's adjustment difficulties. The baby, now 8 months old and still motherless, requires constant attention that prevents you from addressing other pressing household needs. His feeding schedule, complicated by his refusal to accept food from unfamiliar sources, disrupts every attempt to establish routine meal preparation. His sleep patterns, disturbed by anxiety about abandonment, make rest impossible for everyone in the house. His developmental delays, caused by inadequate early care, suggest problems that might require long-term specialised attention. Your husband's approach to remarriage reflects his view of wives as domestic employees rather than family partners. He expects immediate improvement in household management, without providing training, resources, or adjustment time for integrating multiple family units with different backgrounds and needs. His critiques of your performance begin within days, comparing your domestic skills unfavourably to his deceased wife's capabilities, while ignoring the different circumstances you face. The economic pressures of supporting 7 children plus 2 adults strain Katie's resources beyond their previous limits. Food rationing becomes necessary to prevent complete budget collapse, but reducing nutrition for growing children creates health problems that require expensive medical attention. The mathematics of large family survival in ancient Egypt work only when all variables align perfectly. Any disruption creates cascading problems that overwhelm available solutions. Your relationship with your own daughter becomes complicated by her need to compete for attention with 6 step-siblings who have prior claims on household resources and your time. She develops behavioural problems that mirror those of her new siblings, while simultaneously trying to maintain her special relationship with you, despite circumstances that make individual attention nearly impossible to provide consistently. The neighbourhood's reaction to your remarriage combines relief that you've resolved your unmarried status with scepticism about the viability of your new household arrangement. Ancient Egyptian communities recognise that large blended families require exceptional management skills and resources to function successfully. Your visible struggles with household chaos confirm community predictions that this marriage might solve some problems while creating others equally serious. The physical demands of caring for 7 children while managing domestic production beyond your previous experience quickly reveal the limitations of your strength and skills. Ancient Egyptian women are conditioned for hard work, but the intensity of a constant childcare combined with textile production, food preparation, and household maintenance exceeds normal human capacity. Your body begins showing signs of strain that suggest long-term health consequences. The emotional isolation of your new marriage becomes apparent as you realise that Keti views you primarily as solution to his practical problems rather than companion for sharing life's experiences. His conversations focus on household logistics and child management issues, rather than personal interests or feelings. Your relationship lacks the emotional intimacy that made your first marriage bearable despite its obvious problems and ultimate failure. Your daily routine develops around crisis management rather than productive activity. Someone is always sick, hungry, injured, or emotionally distressed, requiring immediate attention that prevents completion of other essential tasks. The constant interruptions make efficient domestic work impossible while creating the appearance of incompetence that confirms your husband's low opinion of your capabilities. Sleep deprivation from night wakings, anxiety about household responsibilities, and physical exhaustion from constant activity affect your mental clarity and emotional stability. Ancient Egyptian medicine doesn't recognize maternal burnout as a medical condition requiring treatment. Your symptoms get attributed to spiritual weakness or moral failure rather than reasonable response to impossible circumstances. The realization gradually dawns that remarriage hasn't solved your problems, but has instead exchanged them for different, potentially more serious difficulties. Your economic security depends entirely on maintaining your husband's satisfaction with your performance, but the demands of your situation exceed any reasonable person's capacity to meet successfully. You've traded the uncertainty of single life for the crushing certainty of inevitable failure in circumstances designed to overwhelm even exceptional women. As you collapse onto your sleeping mat after another 18-hour day of managing domestic chaos, while 7 children finally sleep in various states of cleanliness and contentment, you understand that ancient Egyptian remarriage for divorced women isn't about finding happiness or security. It's about choosing which form of exploitation you're prepared to accept in exchange for the social respectability that comes at the cost of everything else that might make life worth living. 6 months into your second marriage, the initial optimism that comes with solving immediate problems has evaporated like water spilled on hot sand, leaving behind the gritty reality of daily existence that makes your previous struggles seem quaint by comparison. Managing 7 children while maintaining household production has revealed physical limitations you didn't know you possessed, and emotional resources you didn't realise could be depleted so thoroughly. The children's adjustment to your presence has created a complex hierarchy of relationships that requires constant negotiation and frequent crisis intervention. Nefertiti continues viewing you as competition for household authority, occasionally sabotaging your domestic arrangements to demonstrate her superior knowledge of family routines and individual preferences. Her passive-aggressive resistance manifests in subtle ways, forgetting to mention that one child is allergic to certain foods, neglecting to warn you about another's tendency towards sleepwalking, or providing incorrect information about bedtime routines that results in hours of unnecessary conflict. The middle children have developed sophisticated strategies for playing you against each other and against their father, manipulating adult authority figures to avoid responsibilities and secure advantages. Their skill at creating household drama exceeds your ability to manage it effectively, especially when you're simultaneously trying to care for an infant whose needs remain constant, regardless of what chaos erupts around him. Your own daughter's transformation from cooperative child to attention-seeking competitor breaks your heart while adding another layer of complexities to domestic management that already exceeds your capabilities. She's learned to create crises that force you to choose between her needs and those of her step-siblings, putting you in impossible positions where any decision results in someone feeling neglected and resentful. Her psychological regression to earlier developmental stages suggests stress levels that would concern any parent with time to address them properly. The baby's continued resistance to maternal bonding creates practical problems that affect every aspect of household functioning. His refusal to accept food from you consistently means that mealtimes become elaborate negotiations involving multiple people and backup plans. His inability to sleep through the night means that you're chronically exhausted while trying to manage complex household logistics that would challenge well-rested adults with fewer responsibilities. Ketty's evaluation of your performance as second wife compares unfavourably to idealised memories of his first marriage, which has achieved martyr-like status in his recollections that emphasises her domestic competence while minimising any problems or challenges she might have faced. His deceased wife becomes a standard of comparison that no living woman could meet, especially one dealing with circumstances she never encountered during her lifetime. The economic strain of supporting a larger household has forced budget cuts that affect nutrition, clothing, and basic maintenance in ways that create health problems requiring expensive solutions your family can't afford. The children's frequent illnesses, caused partly by inadequate food and overcrowded living conditions, require medical attention that consumes resources needed for basic survival. Ancient Egyptian healthcare for large families operates on triage principles that force parents to choose which problems can be addressed and which must be endured. Your physical deterioration accelerates under the constant demands of large family management combined with chronic sleep deprivation and inadequate nutrition. Your hands develop permanent calluses and joint problems from increased textile work needed to generate additional income. Your back aches constantly from lifting children and heavy household equipment. Your menstrual cycles become irregular due to stress and malnutrition, suggesting reproductive problems that could affect future pregnancy outcomes. The social isolation of your new marriage intensifies as community relationships become complicated by your association with a household that neighbours view as chaotic and possibly unstable. Other wives avoid close friendship with someone whose domestic situation might reflect poorly on their own competence or create obligations to provide assistance they can't afford. Your reputation within the neighbourhood shifts from divorced woman seeking stability to overwhelmed stepmother creating disturbances. Your relationship with your father becomes strained by his relief at resolving your unmarried status, despite obvious evidence that your current circumstances might not represent improvement over previous alternatives. His investment in believing that remarriage solved your problems prevents him from acknowledging that different problems have replaced previous ones, some potentially more serious than those you faced as a divorced woman living in his household. The seasonal rhythms that once provided structure and anticipation now bring anxiety about resource management and seasonal challenges that affect large families more severely than smaller ones. Flood season means increased risk of illness and reduced income opportunities when the household can least afford either problem. Harvest season brings additional work demands when you're already functioning beyond capacity. The religious obligations of large family life create spiritual burdens that compete with practical necessities for time and resources you don't possess. Multiple children require individual attention to religious education and ceremonial participation. Household deities demand offerings that strain the family budget, while promising protection that doesn't seem particularly effective at preventing the constant stream of minor disasters that characterize daily life. Your marriage to Ketty has begun resembling an endurance contest rather than domestic partnership, with success measured by survival rather than happiness or mutual satisfaction. The daily question becomes not whether you can manage household responsibilities successfully, but whether you can avoid complete breakdown while maintaining the appearance of competent domestic management that preserves your husband's satisfaction with the marriage arrangement. The gradual realization emerges that ancient Egyptian remarriage for divorced women often involves exchanging one set of impossible circumstances for another, differently impossible set of circumstances, without actually providing the security and stability that motivated accepting marriage proposals in the first place. Your second marriage hasn't solved the fundamental problem of women's economic dependence on male protection. It has simply illustrated how that dependence can trap women in situations that consume their physical and emotional resources while providing minimal actual security. As you survey the domestic chaos of 7 children requiring attention, while your husband discusses his dissatisfaction with recent household management during his evening meal, you realize that successful ancient Egyptian remarriage requires superhuman capabilities that no actual woman possesses, making failure inevitable regardless of individual effort or commitment to making impossible arrangements work somehow. The collapse of your second marriage begins not with dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet acknowledgement that human beings have limits, and you've reached yours in ways that make continued pretense impossible. The breaking point arrives during a particularly devastating week when 3 children develop fever simultaneously, the baby refuses all food for 2 days straight, and your husband announces that his business partner will be visiting with his family, requiring hospitality preparations that exceed your current capacity to manage. Your physical breakdown manifests first as simple exhaustion that rest doesn't remedy, progressing to symptoms that ancient Egyptian medicine can't effectively treat: constant headaches, stomach problems that make eating difficult, joint pain that interferes with basic movement, and emotional numbness that makes caring for 7 children feel like performing impossible tasks while sleepwalking. Your body has reached the limit of what chronic stress and overwork can extract from human physiology. The children respond to your declining capability with increased behavioral problems that create additional challenges precisely when you're least equipped to handle them effectively. They sense instability in their household management and react with attention-seeking behaviors, increased conflicts among themselves, and regression to earlier developmental stages that require more intensive supervision. Their psychological needs multiply just as your ability to meet them diminishes below minimum acceptable levels. Katie's reaction to household deterioration follows predictable patterns. Criticism of your performance increases while support or assistance remains non-existent. Ancient Egyptian husbands expect wives to manage domestic problems independently while maintaining high standards of household production and childcare. Your obvious struggles suggest personal inadequacy rather than impossible circumstances that would challenge anyone's capabilities. The community's response to your household's visible dysfunction shifts from sympathetic concern to judgmental criticism that affects your family's social standing and economic opportunities. Neighbours who once offered friendly assistance now avoid association with a family that appears unstable and potentially problematic. Your reputation as competent wife and mother dissolves as evidence accumulates that your current responsibilities exceed your capabilities. The economic consequences of household mismanagement begin affecting family survival in ways that threaten everyone's welfare. Decreased textile production reduces income, while increased medical expenses from multiple sick children drain savings. Food preparation problems lead to waste and nutritional deficiencies that affect children's health and development. Your inability to maintain efficient domestic operations creates cascading problems that worsen rapidly. Your relationship with your own daughter reaches a crisis point when she begins acting out in ways that clearly communicate her distress about the household situation and her resentment about sharing your attention with six-step siblings whose needs often take priority over hers. Her emotional regression and behavioural problems add guilt to your growing list of feelings about your inability to provide adequate care for the person you love most while meeting obligations to other children who depend on your survival skills. The recognition gradually emerges that your marriage to Ketty has become a mutual disaster that serves no one's interests effectively. He needs a wife capable of managing his large household competently, while you need circumstances that don't exceed human capacity for domestic labour and childcare. Your incompatible needs create ongoing conflict that makes daily life miserable for everyone, while solving none of the practical problems that motivated the marriage arrangement. The discussion about ending your second marriage occurs without the formal legal proceedings that characterized your first divorce. Ancient Egyptian society recognizes that some marriages fail quickly and completely, making lengthy legal processes unnecessary when both parties acknowledge that continuation serves no useful purpose. Your departure from Ketty's household involves practical arrangements rather than complex property negotiations or custody disputes. Your return to your father's house brings mixed reactions. Relief that your immediate crisis has been resolved, combined with anxiety about resuming financial responsibility for your support and concern about your apparent inability to maintain stable marriage arrangements. Your family's patience with repeated domestic failures has limits that approach quickly, when resources remain scarce and alternative solutions seem increasingly unlikely. The community's reaction to your second divorce within 2 years creates social stigma that affects both your immediate prospects and your daughter's future opportunities. Ancient Egyptian society tolerates divorced women and even accepts remarriage failures, but multiple marriage breakdowns suggest character problems or circumstantial challenges that make future marriage arrangements increasingly difficult to secure. Your physical recovery from the stress of managing an impossible household requires months of reduced activity and improved nutrition that your father's family can barely afford to provide. The joint problems, digestive issues, and chronic fatigue you develop during your second marriage suggest long-term health consequences that might affect your ability to work effectively or manage future domestic responsibilities successfully. The psychological impact of 2 marriage failures before age 25 creates depression and anxiety that ancient Egyptian culture doesn't recognize as legitimate medical conditions requiring treatment. Your emotional state affects your ability to plan effectively for your daughter's future or make reasonable decisions about your own limited options for economic security and social respectability. The mathematical reality becomes clear. Ancient Egyptian society has constructed a marriage system that makes women economically dependent on male protection, while simultaneously creating circumstances that make successful marriage extremely difficult for women who lack exceptional resources, skills, or luck. Your personal failures reflect systematic problems rather than individual inadequacy, but society judges results rather than circumstances when evaluating women's worth and future prospects. As you lie on a sleeping mat in your father's house once again, listening to the familiar sounds of a household that can't afford to support you indefinitely, while your daughter sleeps beside you, and your future stretches ahead without viable alternatives, you understand that ancient Egyptian marriage isn't designed to provide women with security and happiness. It's designed to extract maximum value from their reproductive and domestic labour, while maintaining social structures that benefit everyone except the women whose lives get consumed by impossible expectations and systematic exploitation. You're 30 years old now, which in ancient Egypt means you're approaching the end of your natural lifespan, with a resume that includes 2 failed marriages, 1 daughter whose future prospects have been damaged by your inability to provide stable family circumstances, and a body that shows wear patterns typically associated with women a decade older. The arithmetic of your existence has become brutally simple. You cost more than you produce, and the margin of error continues shrinking with each passing season. Your father's household has absorbed your presence for the second time with resignation that feels more like grief than welcome. His other children, now approaching their own marriage ages, view your continued residence as potential threat to their inheritance rights and social standing. Your stepmother's patience, never abundant, has been exhausted by repeated cycles of crisis management that seem to resolve temporarily, before regenerating in new forms that demand equivalent attention and resources. The neighbourhood women who once offered sympathetic support now discuss your situation in terms typically reserved for chronic diseases or persistent pests, something unfortunate that affects community welfare but resists effective treatment despite repeated intervention attempts. Your reputation has just evolved from unfortunate divorced woman to problem requiring management, a shift that affects your daughter's social standing and future marriage prospects in ways that compound daily. Ancient Egyptian society has specific categories for women who don't fit the standard life patterns, and you've graduated to the most problematic classification, the woman who consumes resources without producing equivalent value and whose continued existence creates obligations that other families can't afford to ignore, but also can't afford to fulfill adequately. Your survival depends on community charity that operates within limits established by other families' primary responsibilities to their own members. Univ, your daughter, now 7 years old, has developed psychological strategies for managing the instability that has characterized her entire life experience. She's learned not to form strong attachments to living situations that might disappear without warning, not to invest heavily in relationships with potential stepfathers who might reject her, and not to expect consistency from circumstances that might change without warning, and not to expect consistency from circumstances beyond anyone's control. Her premature emotional maturity breaks your heart while simultaneously impressing you with her adaptability to conditions that would challenge adults with significantly more life experience and resources. The economic calculations surrounding your continued existence have become a family mathematics problem that gets discussed in whispered conferences when they think you're sleeping. Your brother, now married with his own children, advocates for practical solutions that don't involve indefinite financial support from resources his own family needs. Your stepmother presents budgets that demonstrate how your presence affects everyone's nutrition and comfort levels. Your father weighs his obligations to you against his responsibilities to family members whose futures haven't been compromised by repeated domestic failures. The community's response to your prolonged unmarried status has shifted from sympathetic concern to practical problem-solving that focuses on removing you as a burden from social systems designed to support temporary crises rather than permanent dependence. The neighborhood women who once offered emotional support now discuss your situation in terms of resource management and social responsibility, calculating how long community charity should continue before alternative solutions become necessary. Your health continues deteriorating under the stress of economic insecurity and social displacement that creates anxiety about your daughter's future, while providing no viable alternatives for securing it. The joint problems developed during your second marriage have worsened without proper treatment. Your digestive issues persist due to irregular nutrition and chronic worry. Your menstrual cycles have become increasingly unpredictable, suggesting reproductive problems that would make future pregnancy dangerous even if marriage opportunities existed. The religious community's interpretation of your circumstances has evolved from spiritual counseling about divine plans to discussions about accepting God's will and preparing for whatever fate awaits women who can't maintain stable marriages in societies designed around male authority and female compliance. The priests who once offered hope about future redemption now focus on spiritual preparation for outcomes that seem increasingly predetermined by economic and social forces beyond individual control. Your daughter's educational needs compete with immediate survival concerns in ways that force impossible choices about resource allocation. She's reached the age where other children begin learning domestic skills that will determine their future marriage prospects and economic value. Your inability to provide stable household training environment affects her preparation for adult life, while your family's financial constraints limit alternatives for ensuring her proper development. The seasonal cycles continue marking time while your situation remains essentially static except for gradual deterioration that suggests eventual crisis requiring decisive action. Each harvest season reminds you of economic productivity you can't achieve. Each flood season brings anxiety about resource scarcity during periods when additional expenses strain family budgets beyond their limits. Each religious festival highlights social isolation and family tensions that your continued presence creates. Your relationship with your daughter has become your primary source of meaning, while simultaneously representing your greatest failure. She loves you completely, while gradually understanding that your inability to provide security affects her own future prospects in ways that compound daily. Teaching her to manage expectations about adult life feels like preparing her for disappointment while trying to maintain enough hope to justify continued effort toward improvement that seems increasingly unlikely. As you watch another sunset from your father's courtyard while your daughter practices domestic skills with her step-grandmother, and adult conversations about household management continue in voices pitched low enough to suggest serious concern about long-term sustainability, you realize that ancient Egyptian society has successfully created conditions where women's economic dependence on male protection makes independence impossible, while simultaneously making successful dependence extremely difficult to achieve or maintain throughout the unpredictable circumstances that characterize normal human existence. Your 31st year arrives with the subtlety of a limestone block dropped from a temple roof, marking not just another birthday, but your official transition into the category ancient Egyptian society reserves for women who have exhausted their reproductive potential without securing permanent male protection. The expendable surplus that communities tolerate until resources become too scarce to support non-productive members who consume more than they contribute to collective survival. The marriage proposals have stopped entirely, not through formal announcement, but through the gradual recognition that your combination of advanced age, proven domestic, instability, and declining physical condition makes you an unattractive investment for men seeking wives who can provide years of productive service and successful child-rearing. The mathematics of ancient Egyptian marriage markets don't accommodate women whose best years have been consumed by failed relationships and whose remaining time offers minimal return on investment costs. Your father's discussions about your future have become increasingly frank conversations about practical alternatives that acknowledge the limitations of extended family charity, while exploring options that might preserve some dignity while addressing the fundamental problem of your long-term care. These conversations happen around you rather than with you, treating your preferences as secondary considerations compared to family survival needs and community obligations that have limits approaching quickly. The local temple's widow support program offers one alternative: dedicated religious service in exchange for basic shelter and sustenance that would remove you as a burden from your father's household, while providing socially acceptable occupation for women who can't maintain marriages. The work involves cleaning sacred spaces, preparing offerings, and assisting with religious ceremonies that require female participation but don't demand the physical strength or domestic skills that your deteriorating condition makes increasingly difficult to provide consistently. Temple service appeals to your exhausted corporal spirit as a form of socially respectable surrender, acknowledgement that normal life paths have failed while choosing dignified retreat rather than continued struggle against circumstances that exceed your capacity to manage successfully. The work would be demanding but predictable, providing routine and purpose without the emotional volatility and impossible expectations that characterized your marriage attempts. The practical implications of temple service include permanent separation from your daughter, who would remain with your father's family to receive proper domestic training and marriage preparation that your own circumstances make impossible to provide. This separation represents the final sacrifice required by ancient Egyptian social systems that prioritize collective welfare over individual family bonds, when resources become insufficient to support both personal preferences and community stability. Your daughter's reaction to discussions about potential separation reveals her own adaptation to circumstances beyond her control, while highlighting the emotional costs of systematic family disruption that characterizes women's lives in societies designed around male economic control. She has learned to accept uncertainty about living arrangements while maintaining emotional connections that might be interrupted without warning by adult decisions about practical necessities. The community's response to your potential temple service involves relief that your situation might be resolved through socially acceptable means, rather than continued dependence on extended family resources that affect multiple households' economic stability. Your transition from problem-requiring management to dedicated religious servant would eliminate ongoing social obligations while providing useful services that benefit collective spiritual welfare. Your physical preparation for temple service reveals how thoroughly your two marriages have damaged your health and reduced your capacity for demanding work. The joint problems developed during years of intensive domestic labor continue worsening without proper treatment. Your digestive issues persist due to chronic stress and irregular nutrition. Your vision has begun deteriorating from years of detailed textile work in inadequate lighting conditions that characterize most ancient Egyptian domestic environments. The emotional preparation for temple service involves accepting that your dreams of marital happiness and family stability were unrealistic expectations that ancient Egyptian society doesn't support for women who lack exceptional resources, skills, or fortune. Your failures reflect systematic problems rather than personal inadequacy, but societies judge results rather than circumstances when evaluating individual worth and future potential. Your relationship with your daughter during the final months before potential separation intensifies in ways that make ordinary moments feel precious while simultaneously preparing both of you for loss that seems increasingly inevitable. Teaching her practical skills becomes more urgent while emotional bonding requires careful management to prevent attachment patterns that would make separation traumatic beyond necessity. The religious preparation for temple service involves learning ceremonial procedures and spiritual disciplines that provide structure for life organised around collective welfare, rather than personal desires or individual family units. Ancient Egyptian temple communities offer alternative social arrangements for women who can't succeed within marriage systems, but these alternatives require surrendering most personal autonomy in exchange for basic security and socially acceptable purpose. Your gradual acceptance of temple service reflects exhaustion with struggle more than enthusiasm for religious dedication. But ancient Egyptian society recognizes that spiritual commitment often emerges from practical necessity rather than mystical calling. Women who choose temple service after marriage failures frequently develop genuine devotion to religious duties that provide meaning and community connection within structured environments designed to support collective rather than individual welfare. As you practice ceremonial procedures, while your daughter learns domestic skills from your stepmother and your father calculates household budgets that might finally balance without your ongoing expenses, you understand that ancient Egyptian temple service represents not spiritual calling, but systematic solution for managing women who can't successfully navigate marriage systems designed to extract maximum value from their reproductive and domestic labour, while providing minimal security or satisfaction in return for lifelong service to male-controlled institutions. The day of your departure to temple service arrives with the clinical efficiency of ancient Egyptian bureaucracy, paperwork processed, living arrangements confirmed, personal possessions inventoried and packed into bundles that represent 31 years of existence reduced to items small enough to carry by hand. Your life gets compressed into the space equivalent of a grain storage basket, which feels appropriate since you're essentially being transferred from one form of institutional management to another. Your daughter handles the separation with the emotional control she's developed through years of adapting to circumstances beyond her influence. But her carefully maintained composure cracks occasionally to reveal grief that would be overwhelming if she allowed herself to experience it fully. He's learned that expressing too much distress about adult decisions makes situations more difficult without changing outcomes, so she manages her feelings with psychological skills that 8-year-olds shouldn't need to develop. The walk to the temple compound takes you through neighbourhoods where you once lived as a wife, past houses where you experienced brief periods of hope about marital happiness that seems impossibly naive from your current perspective. The buildings look smaller than you remembered, the streets narrower, the people younger and more optimistic about futures that you now understand are largely determined by economic forces and social systems rather than individual effort or moral character. The temple itself, dedicated to Hathor, goddess of women and childbirth, operates with the paradoxical efficiency that characterizes ancient Egyptian religious institutions. Spiritual devotion combined with practical resource management that makes sacred spaces function as economic enterprises supporting large communities of priests, servants, and dedicated workers who have chosen or been forced into religious service as alternative to conventional family life. Your integration into temple routine involves learning ceremonial procedures that provide structure for days organized around collective spiritual duties rather than individual domestic responsibilities. The work is demanding but predictable. Cleaning sacred spaces before dawn, preparing offerings throughout the day, assisting with religious ceremonies in the evening, and maintaining temple equipment and supplies that support ongoing religious services for community members who pay fees for priestly attention to their spiritual needs. The other women in temple service represent variations on your own story: divorced, wives, widows without family support, unmarried women whose circumstances made marriage impossible or undesirable, and occasional volunteers who chose religious dedication over conventional family life. Their backgrounds differ, but their current situations share common elements: economic dependence on a religious institution, social status that exists outside normal family structures, and daily routines that prioritize collective welfare over personal preferences or individual relationships. The living arrangements in temple quarters provide basic security without luxury or privacy that characterized even your worst marital accommodations. You share sleeping space with other women, eat communal meals prepared by temple servants, and wear simple linen clothing provided by religious authorities rather than maintaining personal wardrobes or individual household possessions. Your identity becomes absorbed into institutional functioning rather than expressed through personal relationships or family connections. The spiritual dimensions of temple service involve daily participation in religious ceremonies that celebrate divine authority, while reinforcing social hierarchies that place women in supportive rather than leadership roles within sacred communities. Your devotion to Hathor becomes genuine over time, but it emerges from practical gratitude for the institutional support rather than mystical experiences or theological conviction about divine intervention in human affairs. Your connection to your daughter continues through occasional visits that become less frequent as she adapts to life in your father's household and prepares for her own eventual marriage through domestic training that you couldn't provide during years of marital instability and economic uncertainty. Watching her develop skills and confidence under more stable circumstances provides satisfaction mixed with grief about your inability to create security that would have prevented separation. The community's perception of your temple service evolves from relief about resolved social problem to acceptance of your new role as dedicated religious worker who contributes useful services while no longer requiring family support or creating obligations for neighbours who have their own economic pressures and social responsibilities. Your transformation from burden to institutional asset reflects successful operation of social systems designed to manage surplus population through religious rather than family structures. Your physical health stabilizes within temple routine that provides adequate nutrition, regular sleep, and work demands that match your declining capabilities without creating overwhelming stress or impossible expectations. The joint problems and digestive issues that develop during marriage persist but don't worsen under circumstances that prioritize long-term sustainability over maximum productivity extraction. Your emotional adjustment to institutional life involves accepting limitations while finding meaning in daily routines that serve collective purposes rather than individual desires. Ancient Egyptian temple service provides alternative social identity for women who can't succeed within marriage systems, but this alternative requires surrendering most personal autonomy in exchange for basic security and socially acceptable purpose within religious communities. As you complete your evening duties and prepare for sleep in communal quarters where other women share similar stories of marital failure and social displacement, you realize that your life represents not individual tragedy, but systematic patterns that ancient Egyptian society has developed for managing women whose economic dependence on male protection makes independence impossible, while making successful dependence extremely difficult to achieve within social structures designed to prioritize male authority and collective stability over individual happiness or personal fulfillment. The brutal mathematics of ancient Egyptian marriage have been perfectly calibrated. They extract maximum value from women's reproductive and domestic labor while providing minimal security in return, then offer institutional alternatives like temple service for those who survive the system's demands long enough to require disposal when their productive capacity diminishes. Your story ends not with death or redemption, but with absorption into religious bureaucracy that transforms personal failure into social utility, the final victory of a system designed to consume women's lives while maintaining the illusion that their suffering serves necessary purposes in maintaining cosmic order and community welfare. The candles flicker in the temple sanctuary as you drift towards sleep, surrounded by women whose dreams of marital happiness were crushed by the same systematic exploitation that destroyed yours. All of you now serving goddesses who promised protection and they couldn't deliver, from social systems they never intended to challenge. In ancient Egypt, even the gods know their place in hierarchies designed to benefit everyone except the women, whose prayers keep the temples functioning. and whose sacrifices maintain the cosmic order that makes everyone else's happiness possible. Your marriage was brutal, but now you understand it was supposed to be.